elite of town back then. Those were the days of Prohibition, of course, so I think the strongest thing they could drink was Coca-Cola. He ran down there and told him his scheme.
Rapelier suggested they take up the ACLU's challenge and arrest one of Dayton's own teachers for teaching evolution. They would have a trial. It would be covered in the newspapers. People would come to Dayton from miles around.
And the thought grew there that we could do that and help advertise our town and bring in industry. And maybe we'll get back on our feet.
They needed a teacher willing to go along with their plan. John Scopes, an easygoing bachelor, seemed the perfect choice. Scopes was playing tennis when a messenger found him.
He arrived at the drugstore, they sat him down, and here around him were all the town officials.
Later, when the Scopes trial became world famous, the drugstore conspirators posed for the cameras. George Rapelier, who set things in motion, F.E. Robinson, owner of the drugstore, and the defendant, John Thomas Scopes. Scopes agreed to be arrested because he wanted to help his boss. After all, F.E. Robinson was also president of the school board. But Scopes had another reason for agreeing to the plan. As he later wrote, "I knew that sooner or later someone would have to stand up for the stifling of freedom that the Anti-Evolution Act represented." Rapelier called a sheriff, and they swore out a warrant for John Scopes' arrest. While Scopes returned to his tennis game, the school superintendent called a reporter for the Chattanooga Times. "Something has happened," he said, "that's going to put Dayton on the map."
The spectacle of a town government actually indicting a teacher for teaching the theory of evolution immediately caught the nation's attention.
Overnight, John Scopes became a controversial figure. To some, he was a martyr for science. To others, an ambassador of the devil. Darwin's theory of evolution was about to go on trial in a little town in Tennessee.
The town was buzzing with excitement, not over the trial, but over all of the people coming to town.
Hollywood sent newsreel crews and photographers. Telegraph operators set up their relay equipment in a grocery store on Main Street. At a cost of $1,000 a day, Chicago's WGN radio was all set to broadcast the trial live, a first in American history.
The pull must have been irresistible to want to tune in. I mean, literally, to hear anything on the radio was fantastic, but to hear the Scopes monkey trial, wow.
America's leading journalist, H.L. Mencken, came to town with 4 bottles of scotch and a typewriter. Mencken stood for everything sophisticated and modern. As editor of the American Mercury and reporter for the Baltimore Sun, his was the voice of the jazz age. He described the South as an intellectual desert.
And here he comes down to Dayton, Tennessee. Well, I bet they had a hard time finding Dayton, Tennessee on the maps.
So many reporters came to cover the event that the only decent hotel in Dayton, the Aqua, had to turn them away. Now, on the first day of the trial, the principal player was feeling uneasy. The town was filled with men and women who considered the case a duel to the death, Scopes said. Everything I did was likely to be noted. But the crowd wasn't there to see John Scopes.
You take the American personality, if there is such a thing, and divide it in two, and you get Clarence Darrow and William Jennings Bryan.
Everybody in America knew these two giants were coming down to this little southern community to fight over whether humans came from monkeys.
Here to prosecute John Scopes and the teaching of evolution, three-time Democratic presidential nominee William Jennings Bryan. All the ills from which America suffers, he said, can be traced to the teaching of evolution. Ready to defend science and John Scopes' right to teach it, the most famous criminal defense attorney in America, Clarence Darrow. Darrow's whole life had prepared him for this opportunity. Clarence Darrow's father was a carpenter in Kinsman, Ohio. He made furniture for his neighbors and ran a side business as an undertaker. A voracious reader, he collected hundreds of books on science and philosophy and earned a reputation as the village atheist. The fact that my father was a heretic always put him on the defensive, said Darrow, and we children thought it was only right and loyal that we should defend his cause.
This was a time when the rural heartland of America was decidedly Protestant. It had a civic religiosity that pervaded the place and oppressed anyone who did not go along with those viewpoints. His father didn't and would sit around in the general store asking the classic village atheist questions. Clarence Darrow imbibed his father's views, and throughout his life he crusaded for the causes on a national stage that his father had crusaded for on a local stage.
In 1886, after practicing law in a small Ohio town, Clarence Darrow moved his family to Chicago. Five years after his arrival, he was general attorney for the Chicago and Northwestern Railway. He was making lots of money, but he felt, he wrote a friend, like a hypocrite and a slave. It was a time of social upheaval. The crusade of the individual against the powerful excited Clarence Darrow. He quit his corporate job to defend the underdog, strikers, labor leaders, anarchists. Society, he said, is nothing less than organized injustice.
Philosophically, he was a kind of existentialist. His position as to life was, he didn't choose to be born, and he once said that if he'd been given the option, he'd have been asked to be let off. Basically, what he wanted to do was to get through it without being bored.
As soon as Clarence Darrow heard about the anti-evolution trial, he volunteered to defend John Scopes against the state of Tennessee. Darrow came to Dayton because he believed in free speech and because he wanted to challenge a man who was in many ways his polar opposite, William Jennings Bryan.
He was just waiting for the opportunity to confront Bryan. I mean, it was almost manna from heaven that Bryan said that he would go to Dayton.
By 1925, religion had driven a wedge between Darrow and Bryan. But once these two men had fought on the same side, Darrow even supported Bryan in his first presidential campaign when William Jennings Bryan began his remarkable political career.